Well, hi there, welcome to the video where we are going to build a dollhouse silver box, pretty much like this one. And this is the first of 3 projects in which we're going to add hinges to the box and set a ruby into the lid. Okay, so hope you enjoy watching. So this is what the box looks like. Essentially it's going to have a split around about that distance across the side. It's going to be hinged at the back, and it's going to have some repoussed flower decoration included on the top here, and there's going to be a ruby set into the top. Now these are my preliminary drawings. I have set this box up to be 12mm long, 3mm split there and a 5mm split there, so the total from one side is an 8. So the way I'm going to make the box is by firstly taking a single piece, it's actually a standard technique in silversmithing to make a sealed tube where you fold from a single piece and then you solder on the ends of the box. So that's kind of how I'm going to proceed with this. So the idea here is between here and here is 12, and then each of these is going to be 8, except that one there, which is going to be 7.7. Can measure to slightly less. We're going to leave a 1mm ledge here. Now I'm going to just quickly explain why we're going to do that. So what we're firstly going to do is wrap the silver round, starting here in a square tube, coming around to there, and then join it. So if we did that, we would end up with this situation here, where the measurements would end up skewed a little bit, and you would have to chamfer the ends in order to get these two ends to come together. And that's a slightly awkward joint. It's not a very robust joint either as it stands. And remember, we're dealing with something pretty tiny here as well, so doing the chamfer isn't quite as simple as you might think in something that small. We're going to create what's called a butt joint. So the silver will be made into the tube, and between there and there will be 8, between there and there will be 8, and there will be 8. Between there and there though, you got an extra piece here, so this needs to be 7.7mm, because this is about 0.3. I think we, if I remember rightly, we chose 0.3 as the thickness of the silver sheet we're going to use. What that allows us to do is it allows us to put this joint here like this. See if I can get it in focus a bit, and it forms what's called a butt joint. You put flux across here and the solder along the edge, and the solder flows under it and makes a good seal. So this is what the metal looks like. If we bring the camera around a little, this is what we're going to do. This piece now has to be marked out. So what you've got to do with this is you've got to get a square and a ruler and a file, and you've got to make sure that 1, 2 of the sides are at right angles and they are straight, so that you've got what's called a datum to make your measurements from. Let me just write that down. So that provides you with a reference point to roll from. Now I always have the metal pre-cut by Cookson Gold. I do that because it actually saves a ton of work for me to cut it out, and it's also cheaper that I don't end up with a whole lot of spare silver kicking around, which is wasteful really in terms of cost and that. So you measure this with a silversmith square, and I don't actually see any light shining through in the wrong places, because that's the way to check it really. Sometimes when you cut something there's a little raised bit at the edge and it isn't quite as flat as it should be. This particular piece actually does seem to be pretty square, so I'm going to leave it as it is. So here's a little clip just to show that. Essentially you can see where I put little arrows here, that tells me where my reference line is. So I'm now going to go and make measurements using a steel ruler like this and measure this piece out. Okay, so here is my silver. It's been marked off in millimeters. We simply used a steel ruler like this to do that. You have to be careful to get your eye just right over the exact mark so you get it exactly right. So this piece here is about 7.7, is 8, 8, 8 and 1. There's a piece here that's been clipped off the end. To do that we use a pair of very good quality nail scissors that have been case hardened. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just put a file onto this edge and this edge and just make sure there aren't any burrs on it, so that it joins properly and it's nice and bright silver. What we're going to do once we've done that is we're going to get a device called a scoring tool, and we're going to score these lines. Well, not that one, that's just going to be used as a scribe line. We're going to score that line and that line in order to fold the silver accurately. Okay, the silver has now been scored with a scoring tool, and this is a scribe which has been modified with a Dremel grinder to make a very fine point I think that's maybe like 20 degrees, maybe something like that. Might be 30 degrees, not sure. And then sharpen very carefully with a magnifier to make sure it really is sharp. And so you dig in here, here, and here in order to make the silver more accurate to fold. And it's worth taking time getting these measurements right. Now, one thing you notice is this is the extra solder ledge we put on. It's also been marked off on the other side, because when you fold this round, it's actually this side that it comes to. To bend the silver, you can use a steel block, but you've got to be careful of rounding, and I'll show you what that means in a little sketch. When you're dealing with something this small, you can actually use the silversmith's pliers as a block, and you've got to keep checking as you're going. If you hold them tight, it avoids the silver rounding. Keep checking as you're going to make sure that it's straight as you bend it around the side of the pliers. Then go around to the other side and bend the same angle again, just check it, make sure it's right, and then do the next one and do the next one, and just keep going until you've got them all pretty much where you want them to be. If you've got them straight, it should line up onto this line there. Okay, the rounding problem that you get with a steel block, what essentially happens is when you push it over this is your steel block here, when you push it over the steel block, it stays flat on one side to some extent. You may get a little rounded bit here, and then it bends over the other side, but then it rounds like this. What you've got to do is you've got to smooth that out. That's okay as long as you know about that problem. The pliers actually solve that problem because they grip the silver flat while you're bending it, and then you can do both sides, if you see what I mean. Okay, so there's an illustration of the rounding problem. This particular silver, even though it's been scored, it's not stiff enough, if you like, to stop this from happening. So if you go at it from both sides with the pliers, here and here, and also here and here, you will eventually get a good straight bit. And there's still a little bit around in there, you can probably see, but it's not too bad. Okay, when you're done with the bending, using the silversmith's flat pliers, you can see they fit inside it there. It does take a little bit of skill, a little bit of manipulation. You will end up with nearly a box. This might need a little straightening up now, but you can see there's a ledge there to put the solder onto to form the butt joint. The box is pretty much set up to be soldered now, and that's what we're going to do next. Alright, so to solder the little box, all I've really done is I've run some borax flux down this joint, which is silversmith's borax flux. What you see there on top, this is silver solder, and it's the harder high temperature silver solder. We've also nipped the joint together with a piece of iron wire. Iron doesn't stick to silver solder, so give it a wee twist which nips the joint together, and that's how it's done. This will now be soldered. Okay, so a word about silver solder. Silver solder comes in different temperature ranges. When you're starting at the very beginning of a project, you generally use the harder solder, because later on you would use the lower melting point solders, so that the job doesn't fall apart when you heat it up. Essentially, that's the general idea anyway. And you see that solder flows. It flows under the butt joint. It does that because the flux is in there. The flux keeps the oxide from developing on the surface, and it also draws the solder under the joint. Silver solder is anaerobic. When you're soldering with it, you need to keep the oxygen off it, and you do that by keeping the job inside the flame. If you don't, the softer silver solders, the lower temperature ones, are a bit more forgiving, but the hard one that I've just used, it goes black like charcoal, and then you can't do anything with it. And you have to just clean it off and start again. So you got to keep it inside the flame. Okay, so a word about the tools. In order to do that soldering, I used a pair of steel tweezers. Now if you ever see a blacksmith using long handled tongs, notice that there's no insulated handle on the tongs, and if you ever see somebody blowing glass right up to their mouth with a long steel tube, and there's molten glass on the other end of the tube, you ask, well, why don't they burn their mouth? Well, the reason is that steel doesn't conduct heat very well, and and so you generally don't need insulated handles. You can buy silversmith's grips that have got insulated handles, but you don't really need them. So that was that. That's that was used. And the other thing that was used was this is a micro blowtorch, which is available from Cookstone's Gold and eBay and various other places. Right, so that's our silver box chassis kind of sorted out. I've been along with the silversmith's snips, and these are the ones here. You can get these on eBay. They're made in Japan. They're quite nice quality. They're not very strong, so they're good for making small things like this. And I've just cut the edge back here, just here, and I'm going to file it back a little bit there as well. I don't want to go taking this off yet because this tube still isn't very stable, and it won't be stable till the end caps are on, really. Okay, so the next stage is to try and get the end pieces here as flat as you possibly can, and you do that by filing. And you need to check. You can actually just sort of see there where the light's reflecting off it. That means that all the surface is bright and it's ready for solder. And what you should also do is just gently take the edge off that way, and also on the inside, and that allows the solder bead to stick better. Alright, so next off is to put the ends onto the box, which is what we're going to do next. Prepare it for soldering. It's got plastic on both sides, and that needs to be taken off. And then you need to make these as flat as you can. So give them a tap with a rawhide mallet onto a steel block, silver making block like this, and make sure they're flat. And if there's still any notches sticking up, you can put them flat onto a rubber block and file over the top until they're really flat, and then we'll prepare them for soldering. Okay, so here we are. We can do this in a soldering spinner. So you can see the white there, that's the flux, and then the slightly beige colour, that's the hard silver solder. Now you don't want to put any solder on the inside of the box, otherwise the heat doesn't get to it properly. It leaves a charcoaly mess. You've then got to clean it off. Okay, so you put the flux on, and you rely on the flux drawing the solder into the joint. Okay, so there we have one end soldered. So now to do the other side. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this section of the video is I'm going to show you how to solder the other end of the box. And with this we're going to use a slightly bigger blowtorch, and what I've also got here is a device called a spinner. I'll maybe show you a full shot of the spinner later, but this is on a spinner. So I've deliberately turned the torch flame down, and the reason for that is I just don't want to blow this thing away. And what you do is you keep the box in the flame so that the hard solder doesn't go off, and then you can just go back and just check you've got it right where it should be. Now what you should do is always wear safety glasses when you're doing this, because inside the box is air, and when you heat it the air becomes pressurized, and this kind of construction can go pop, and molten bits of metal will end up in your face. So just be careful with this kind of thing. We've soldered both ends onto the box now. The next stage is to make this into a nice flat smooth box without any of these ridgy serrature bits and all that kind of nonsense. So I'm just going to show you a basic technique called side shear, which is used for making cufflinks. So the way that side shear technique works is when you're making cufflinks, you rest the side of the cufflink onto the flat surface there, and you put this piece underneath, and then you trim away, and I'm going to show you roughly how it's done. This is a bit small to be doing this with this size of shear, but this is more of a like a graphic illustration, like so. So essentially when you go to cut, you get a flush cut right along the side. So obviously I'm not going to use those. I'm going to use the nail scissors to do it, but that's how I'm going to do it essentially. It's going to be a bit of a challenge to get this on camera because the depth of field is a bit shallow, but I'll give it a blast. So as you can see, it's actually quite difficult to do on camera, but that's kind of what you would do. Okay, so take the shears away, you can see how I've flush cut it. So essentially what you do now is you get a fairly coarse file, and we start to file these off. And it's always best to take as much metal off as you can by cutting it off. And so you can get these precision shears. These are side cutter shears. We're going to cut the little knop on the edge there off with these, so that there's less to file down. When this is filed down, I'll show you the result, and you'll see it should be a nice and smooth and fairly square box. This discoloration here, by the way, this is fire stain, which is common in silversmithing. You just ignore that for the moment, that's fine. Okay, so this is what our box looks like just now. It's nice and smooth, nice and cube shaped, and it's ready. And just as a heads up, that's how big it is. To get the ridges down, you use a slightly rounded file like this. If you use it evenly, it serrates the ridges off pretty fast, a bit faster than a flat file does. So once you've got the flat file, after you've got the ridges off, you flat file it with a heavy flat file like this, and then you take the corners to rounded, and then you go across the flat surface like so. Once you've done that, you then use a file like this, which is a much finer grade. This file is then used to remove the serrated marks that are left by this. So if you can see here, this is a Val orb, number 2, I believe. And if you look at this one, Val orb, by the way, are the best files you can get. This is a number 4, so it's much finer than the other one. Okay, so the marking off stage, as you can see, I've got 3mm there, and then essentially you run them down the side like this. I set it just slightly over 3mm, so that when this is resting on here, it comes out about exactly right. And I'm just going to show you the sides so you can see that I've done it so that it matches. So this is the line now that you cut to get the top off. I don't advise that you use a vise. I advise that you use your fingers. Essentially you have a rubber block, and there's a number of channels that have been gouged into the side of the block, and the purpose of those channels is specifically to do things like this, so that you can hold a job like this steady. You essentially want a silversmith's saw. When you're sawing something like this, you use your finger as a guide. It might be better actually just to show it the other way first. Because I'm trying to do this on a camera, it's a bit tricky. It would be easier if it wasn't on a camera. So you just use the edge of your finger there as a guide to guide the saw into the right slot at the right place. And then you do around the edges first. As you can see, I haven't done that edge, and then you start sawing away at the centres until the lid comes off. And I'll show you the different stages of it as we go along. So there you can see we're at the stage where we've cut the ends, and I've made a little score mark there so we know which way around the lid goes. And then we're about to cut the centres, and eventually the lid will come off. Okay, so here we are with it completely sawn. You can see the little score mark here which I made so that I know which end is which. Now inside you can see there's a lot of sprue. That's why I've got the little Stanley knife in my hand. The way that you get that off is just to run a blade down the edge of it like so, and that just cleans it off. And you can then file that as well if you want. But you notice the inside, there's a little bit of flux there. There's no sort of blackened, charred, hard silver or anything like that. The silversmith's pickle will clean off the flux, and I end up with a nice silver box inside. Right, so the next job to do is firstly to clean this rim up. While you've got the opportunity to actually clean something up in a fairly straightforward manner, such as when we had the cube just a few shots back, and now we've got this edge which is clean and clear everything at the moment, then you should take that opportunity. Don't leave it till later, because later on it could be more difficult to do, sometimes nearly impossible to do. So, and we've done that, we're going to sort out the sealing rim which goes around here. In order to make the sealing rim on the boxes, which goes around here, we've cut a 3mm strip which is more than 40mm long. And then I'm going to cut that off with nail scissors next, in order to form the rim which just fits just inside, so that the lid has something to sit on. We've marked off with engineer's blue, and then we've scribed a line. So this is 3mm wide, and it's about 50 long. If we say 12 and 12 is 24, and then 8 and 8 is 16, and the whole adds up to 40. So we need a 40mm piece to go around the inside. Okay, the next stage, if you look at the box here, you should be able to see there, I have made a round mark here. This is to remind me that that's the front of the box. The front of the box will have the flat part of the rim without the join. The join will go at the back. So what I've then done is put some engineer's blue onto this strip, and we've marked off exactly where it comes to the end. But if you fold at that point, your folded piece will be too big to fit inside the box. So you need to fold about a metal thickness away from that, okay? And then you use the silversmith's pliers to do that. So you can see how we've used the silversmith's pliers to create this, and you can also see just how closely that fits now into the casing. So what we do next is we take the scribe and we'll line this up and we mark off the place where we're going to fold it here. Now these are going to be too long, so they'll get cut off when they're bent over. So here we are with the rim pretty closely fitting, and we've still got a little bit of work to do to get it right. I'm going to have this rim sitting about 1mm above here, and had this been a box without a hinge, I would have had it bigger than that, maybe 2 to 3, I don't know. But it's going to have a hinge, so it needs to move freely, so it's going to have about 1mm there. What you do next is you put your scribe down here and you mark that off, and that's pretty much where you cut it. And it's wise to cut it maybe 1/4 millimetre bigger than the scratch mark, and then you try to fit it and just file it a touch until it fits absolutely perfectly. We've cut it as we described in the last shot, and it's been fluxed, which is what the white stuff is. Flux draws the solder into the join and protects the silver from oxidising while the flame is on it also. And there's a bit of hard solder on there, which is the hardest solder, the highest temperature solder. So I'm going to now use the blowtorch to fix that together. So that is now fixed together. So what we're going to do next is I'm going to file this joint flat, and then I'm going to trim fit this entire rim into the box so that it's a very, very snug fit with only 1mm showing above the rim. Okay, here we are. We've adjusted the rim until it's as tight a fit as we can get it, and you can see there from the top there, it's actually pretty good. And so this is now ready for solder. The crack here between the rim and the box is essentially where you put the solder, so you don't put it inside, because you would never get the heat inside there hot enough. This crack is fluxed now so that the flux draws the solder into the crack, and then we put an easy solder on here, which is a lower temperature solder, so that the solder that was used to make the box, which is a higher temperature solder, still stays solid, because the lower temperature solder melts first, and as soon as it melts you pull away. Now mostly solder is too thin to fill big cracks with, so you have to get this as tight as you can get it. So here we have the silver box with easy solder on it. There, that's it done. There's a certain amount of slippage there on the rim, but that's okay because it can be adjusted with a file. We made it protrude a little bit more than 1mm, so you can see how that's worked. Well folks, there's the first stage of our dollhouse silver box finished, which has a rim. It's going to have hinges later on in the project. There you have a beautiful silver box, and if you look at the size of it on my little finger, you can kind of get an idea of just how big that box is. It is pretty tiny. It's 12mm long by 8 by 8, which is pretty small. Look out for the next part of the project, in which we will put some repousse decoration onto the side of the box, and we'll try to set a ruby into the lid. Thanks very much for watching folks. Look out for the next project. Bye.